São Paulo grew faster than the systems built to control it. By the mid to late 20th century, Brazil's largest city was becoming one of the most densely populated urban centers in the world. Massive migration from rural regions flooded into industrial districts, creating economic opportunity for some and deep poverty for many others. With this growth came rising crime, expanding black market economies, and increasingly organized criminal groups operating inside and outside the city. Carandiru was built as a response to this pressure. It was not created because of one crime, one gang, or one moment in history. It existed because the state needed somewhere to put thousands of people it considered dangerous or unstable to public order. When the Carandiru penitentiary complex expanded during the 20th century, Brazilian authorities believed scale would equal control. If enough inmates could be held inside one centralized structure, then the streets outside could remain stable. It was a strategy built on containment rather than rehabilitation. The goal was removal, physically separating crime from society by locking it behind concrete walls and steel gates. But Brazil in the late 20th century was in transition. The country was moving away from military dictatorship and toward democracy. While political systems were changing, many law enforcement and prison structures remained built on older, more authoritarian foundations. Arrests increased. Court systems slowed. Pre-trial detention became common. Prisons filled faster than they could process or release inmates. Carandiru became the physical solution to an administrative problem. It absorbed overflow from police operations, court backlogs, and rising sentencing rates. Over time, it became one of the largest prison facilities in Latin America, holding thousands more inmates than it was originally designed to contain. Public fear played a major role in Carandiru's continued expansion. Armed robberies, kidnappings, drug trafficking, and violent gang activity dominated headlines during the 1970s through the early 1990s. For many citizens, large prisons represented safety. The public did not see daily life inside the walls. They saw only the idea that dangerous individuals were being removed from society. Inside Carandiru, however, scale created new realities. Overcrowding meant limited medical care, limited supervision, and limited resources. When thousands of men are placed into confined environments, informal power systems emerge. Inmates formed alliances, protection groups, and internal leadership structures. The prison did not officially create these systems, but conditions allowed them to grow. Carandiru slowly transformed from a correctional institution into something closer to a containment ecosystem. The state controlled the perimeter. Inside, order often depended on negotiation, force, or survival hierarchy among inmates. Politically, the prison became symbolic. It showed that the government was acting against crime. It showed that the justice system was still functioning. But at the same time, it exposed deeper structural problems. Poverty, inequality, and social instability continued feeding the prison population. Carandiru existed because reforming society was slow and complex. Building prisons was faster. Locking people away was visible. It reassured the public even when it did not solve the root causes of crime. By the early 1990s, the prison held not just inmates, but the consequences of decades of social pressure, political compromise, and institutional overload. It was a place designed to hold threats. Instead, it became a place where new threats could form, organize, and survive. Carandiru was not created to be humane. It was created to be effective. And for many years, effectiveness was measured by one number: how many people could be kept inside its walls. Carandiru was built to hold people, but more importantly, it was built to manage them in large numbers with limited staff and limited flexibility. The architecture was not designed for comfort, privacy, or rehabilitation. It was designed for visibility, restriction, and rapid response to unrest. The complex was structured as multiple large pavilions rather than small isolated units. Each building housed hundreds, sometimes thousands, of inmates. From the outside, the structures looked industrial: long concrete blocks, narrow window spacing, and reinforced entry points. Movement between pavilions was tightly controlled through locked corridors and gated transition zones that required multiple levels of authorization. Inside, control depended heavily on line-of-sight monitoring. Long corridors allowed guards to observe movement from one end to the other. Cell doors were metal bars or reinforced steel, allowing visual inspection without physical entry. Surveillance cameras were added over time, but much of the early system relied on physical observation from elevated positions, corridor checkpoints, and guard patrol routes. Cells were rarely single occupancy. Overcrowding meant multiple inmates shared spaces designed for far fewer people. Bunk beds were stacked tightly. Personal space was almost non-existent. The design forced inmates into constant proximity, which increased tension but also made it easier to monitor large groups at once. Yards were enclosed by extremely high concrete walls topped with razor wire. In some sections, overhead wire mesh prevented climbing or helicopter extraction attempts. Entry to yard areas was controlled through timed gate releases. Only certain pavilions were allowed yard time at once to prevent mass congregation across the entire facility. Isolation existed, but it was limited by capacity. Punishment or administrative segregation cells were smaller, darker, and more restricted. These spaces were used to remove individuals seen as threats to immediate order, violent inmates, organizers of unrest, or those needing protection from others. Guard movement followed fixed patterns. Predictability allowed staff coordination, but it also required constant communication to avoid blind spots. Radios, visual signals, and locked timing systems controlled when doors opened, when meals were delivered, and when inmates moved between zones. Escape from Carandiru was extremely difficult not only because of physical barriers, but because of layered containment. Even if an inmate passed one security line, they faced another: internal gates, outer fences, open monitored kill zones between buildings, and external perimeter patrols. The surrounding urban environment also made unnoticed escape difficult. The prison sat inside a densely populated zone where unfamiliar movement would be quickly noticed. Lighting played a major role in control. Fluorescent lighting inside removed shadows. Exterior floodlights at night turned the complex into a permanently visible zone. Darkness was considered a security risk, so the facility minimized it whenever possible. The design did not eliminate violence or unrest. Instead, it attempted to make large-scale chaos slower to spread. If one pavilion experienced problems, others could be locked down quickly. Steel doors, manual locking bars, and segmented corridors created choke points that allowed small numbers of guards to contain large inmate populations temporarily. Carandiru's architecture reflected a philosophy common in many mass incarceration systems during the 20th century. Control was achieved through density, visibility, and layered barriers rather than individual behavioral management. The system assumed that maintaining physical dominance over space would maintain order over people. But architecture alone cannot control human behavior indefinitely. Over time, inmates learned the rhythms of movement, the timing of patrols, and the weaknesses in surveillance coverage. The prison remained physically secure, but control inside often became a balance between official authority and informal inmate power structures. Carandiru was not built to be flexible. It was built to hold. And for years, it did exactly that, holding thousands of men inside a system where every wall, gate, and corridor existed to limit choice, limit movement, and limit possibility. Carandiru did not house one type of criminal. It held an entire cross-section of Brazil's criminal justice reality, compressed into one overcrowded environment. The prison became a meeting point for different layers of crime, from street-level offenders to highly organized criminal leadership, all forced to exist inside the same system of concrete, steel, and institutional pressure. A large percentage of the population consisted of inmates convicted of violent crimes. Armed robbery, homicide, aggravated assault, and kidnapping were common categories. São Paulo's rapid urban expansion during the late 20th century produced environments where violent crime could grow alongside economic inequality. Many inmates arrived from densely populated urban districts where gang influence, drug trade, and territorial disputes were part of daily survival. Another major group consisted of drug-related offenders. Drug trafficking networks in Brazil evolved rapidly during the 1980s and early 1990s, linking local street-level distribution to international routes. Some inmates were low-level couriers or street sellers. Others were deeply embedded in organized trafficking structures. Inside Carandiru, these differences mattered. Hierarchies formed quickly. Influence often depended on connections outside the prison walls. There were also inmates awaiting trial. Brazil's overloaded court system meant many individuals remained in detention for extended periods without final sentencing. These inmates lived alongside convicted prisoners, creating a volatile mix of uncertainty, frustration, and fear. Some entered as first-time offenders and were exposed immediately to hardened criminal environments. Security classification inside Carandiru existed on paper, but overcrowding often blurred those distinctions. High-risk inmates were supposed to be separated from lower-risk populations. In reality, capacity limits forced constant mixing. This increased violence risk but also accelerated the formation of prison-based criminal alliances. Psychologically, the inmate population represented extreme adaptation to pressure environments. Many prisoners arrived already shaped by violence, poverty, or gang culture. Others developed survival behaviors after entering the system. Inside Carandiru, emotional restraint often became a survival skill. Showing weakness could invite exploitation. Showing aggression could invite retaliation. Many inmates adopted controlled, emotionally flat behavior patterns, not necessarily by choice, but by necessity. Long-term inmates often became institutionalized. Routine replaced personal identity. The schedule dictated movement, eating, sleeping, and interaction. Over time, some prisoners lost connection with life outside the walls. Others focused entirely on building influence inside, treating the prison population as a structured social system where power could still be gained. Gang presence inside the prison became one of the most defining social structures. Groups provided protection, resource sharing, and enforcement of internal rules. These groups sometimes operated more efficiently than official prison authority in maintaining order within specific cell blocks. For new inmates, aligning with a group often became essential for survival. Not all inmates were gang-affiliated. Some tried to remain neutral, but neutrality was difficult in overcrowded environments. Limited resources, food quality, sleeping space, medical attention, created constant low-level competition. Even non-violent prisoners had to adapt to environments where conflict was always possible. Health conditions also shaped the inmate population experience. Overcrowding increased disease spread. Limited medical infrastructure meant treatable illnesses sometimes became serious threats. Physical survival required constant awareness of hygiene risks, shared spaces, and exposure to untreated conditions. What separated Carandiru inmates from ordinary prison populations in smaller facilities was scale. In smaller prisons, staff might know inmates individually. At Carandiru, inmates often became numbers inside massive housing blocks. Personal oversight was limited. Control relied on population management rather than individual monitoring. Another defining factor was exposure to criminal networking. Inmates who entered with minor criminal backgrounds sometimes left with connections to larger organized structures. The prison unintentionally functioned as a networking environment for criminal operations outside its walls. Many inmates carried psychological trauma before arrival. Inside Carandiru, isolation from family, uncertainty about legal outcomes, and constant exposure to threat environments often intensified mental strain. Depression, anxiety, and emotional withdrawal were common, though rarely formally treated. Carandiru did not separate people based purely on rehabilitation potential. It separated based on availability of space and immediate security needs. This created an environment where first-time offenders, career criminals, violent offenders, and organized crime members often existed in overlapping spaces. Over time, the inmate population inside Carandiru became less about individual crimes and more about survival within a controlled ecosystem. Identity shifted. Outside status mattered less than inside alliances, reputation, and adaptability to institutional life. The prison did not just contain criminals. It contained thousands of individual survival strategies, all competing inside a system designed primarily to hold bodies rather than transform behavior. Life inside Carandiru was defined by repetition, noise, heat, and constant psychological pressure. The prison did not operate like the controlled, quiet environments often imagined in smaller facilities. It was crowded, loud, and emotionally charged, with thousands of men living within extremely limited space. Routine existed, but it was shaped as much by inmate dynamics as by official prison rules. The day typically began early, often before sunrise. Lights were switched on abruptly, flooding cells with harsh fluorescent brightness that erased any sense of natural time. Sleep was rarely deep. Noise from other cells, movement in corridors, and the constant presence of other inmates meant rest was fragmented. For many prisoners, exhaustion became a permanent condition rather than a temporary state. Morning headcounts were a critical part of control. Guards moved through corridors confirming numbers rather than individuals. In a facility of this size, identity was secondary to population control. If numbers matched, the system moved forward. If numbers did not match, the entire block could be locked down until the discrepancy was resolved. Meals were distributed through controlled movement systems or direct delivery depending on the pavilion. Food quality was basic. Nutrition was secondary to volume. For inmates, meal times were less about comfort and more about timing and access. In overcrowded conditions, even food distribution could create tension if supplies felt limited. Movement throughout the day was restricted and scheduled. Yard access, medical visits, legal meetings, and work assignments were tightly controlled. In some areas, inmates might only see open sky for short periods each day. For others, especially those in restricted housing or disciplinary isolation, weeks could pass without meaningful exposure to outdoor light. Silence was not natural inside Carandiru. Instead, the prison had its own constant background noise, metal doors closing, distant shouting, radios crackling, footsteps echoing in corridors. Over time, many inmates learned to mentally filter this noise. Others developed heightened anxiety, unable to fully relax even during sleep. Discipline was enforced both officially and unofficially. Official punishments included isolation cells, loss of privileges, or restricted movement. Unofficial discipline often came from other inmates. Internal group rules existed, and violating them could bring consequences that were immediate and severe. Guards were aware of this internal order but often relied on it to maintain stability across large populations. Hygiene was a daily struggle. Shared showers, limited sanitation supplies, and overcrowded sleeping conditions created constant health risks. Skin infections, respiratory illness, and untreated injuries were common. Access to medical care depended on availability, severity, and sometimes internal inmate hierarchy influence. Mental deterioration was not always dramatic or visible. For many inmates, it was slow. Loss of motivation. Emotional flattening. Difficulty remembering life outside. Some prisoners became extremely quiet, conserving emotional energy. Others became hyperalert, constantly scanning for threat. Long-term exposure to overcrowded confinement changed behavior patterns permanently for many individuals. Time moved differently inside. Days blended together. Without meaningful personal choice or privacy, memory markers disappeared. Some inmates counted time through routine events, meal schedules, yard rotations, or rare visits from family members. Family visits were emotionally complex. For some inmates, they were the only connection to outside life. For others, they were reminders of what had been lost. Physical barriers separated inmates from visitors, turning human contact into controlled communication rather than emotional reunion. From the guard perspective, daily life was also high pressure. Staffing levels were often low compared to inmate population size. Guards relied heavily on routine and structure to prevent sudden unrest. Communication between guard teams was critical. One small miscommunication could create gaps in control. Guards were trained to watch for patterns, sudden silence, unusual grouping, or unexpected movement. In overcrowded environments, early detection of tension could prevent larger incidents. Many guards described working inside Carandiru as mentally exhausting. The scale meant they were never fully in control, only maintaining balance. Violence was unpredictable but always possible. Not constant chaos, but constant potential. Many days passed without major incidents. But tension was never fully absent. Everyone inside, inmates and staff, understood that stability depended on cooperation, fear, routine, and controlled unpredictability. Punishment cells were among the most psychologically severe spaces. Smaller, darker, and more isolated, they removed inmates from population but also removed social identity. For some prisoners, isolation caused extreme anxiety. For others, it created emotional shutdown. Time spent there could change behavior permanently. Carandiru was not designed for comfort, reflection, or rehabilitation. It was designed for containment. Daily life reflected that purpose. Every routine, every movement restriction, every physical barrier reinforced one message: survival depended on adaptation. Inside Carandiru, life was not defined by individual days. It was defined by endurance.